Hello, this is Ubuntu Gicha. Basically, since Linux supports Unicode, it is easy to use by adding various languages and input sources. Personally, I prefer installing Ubuntu in English rather than using the language I am currently using and adding an input source for that language. As long as you configure the input source and default font for that language, there is absolutely no inconvenience in using it even if the Ubuntu is installed in English. Languages such as Korean and Japanese have much wider line spacing compared to English. Although Korean does not look awkward even when reduced to the same line spacing as English, there is a tendency for the line spacing to be wider than necessary because it is aligned with similar types of languages. Even if installed in English, the line spacing for languages like Korean and Japanese is still wider than English in the GUI environment. However, since the baseline is aligned with English, the characters appear less crooked when used alongside English. In the CLI environment, the line height is also aligned with English. In the CLI environment, icons are displayed using font glyphs instead of images, and images are represented using ASCII characters. If the line height is too high, the text stretches vertically, resulting in an awkward appearance. If you have installed Ubuntu in the corresponding language, the directory names under the home directory will consist of names from that language. When you download and install source files, they are downloaded to a path that includes the language. However, if you install by compiling the source files, compilation may occasionally fail if the files contain Unicode. I have gone on a bit of a tangent, but this explains why I installed Ubuntu in English rather than the language I am currently using. Now, let's get started with installing and configuring the desired input source in an English environment. If you go to the keyboard menu in Settings, you can install input sources for various languages. I will explain how to install an input source for another language on an English-only Ubuntu installation based on the method for installing the Korean input source. If you click Other, you can see input sources for many languages other than the currently installed ones. Unfortunately, Hangul input source for Korean is not available. You cannot input Hangul using the Korean input sources shown in the list. They are merely input sources based on the Korean keyboard layout, but since the Korean layout is identical to the English layout, these are meaningless input sources. Go to the System menu and click Region and Language. Click Manage Installed Languages. Click Install, Remove Languages. Keep English selected and add Korean. The newly installed language will take effect after a reboot. Let's return to the keyboard menu. Click Other to view the input sources for more languages. Now, Hangul input source for Korean is visible. Since the Hangul input source also supports English input, I will remove the English input source. I will now configure the Hangul input source. By default, the ibus Hangul input source is configured to handle Hangul toggle and hanja conversion via the Hangul key and hanja key. Keyboards on devices like laptops do not have Hangul key and hanja key and use the right Alt and right Control keys instead. However, this configuration is not set up for them. For keyboards that lack a Hangul key, Shift space is also configured. While there is a way to add the right Alt key to the Hangul toggle shortcut, a better approach is to configure the right Alt key to be recognized as the Hangul key to suit the Korean keyboard layout. You can do this by setting xkb-options in input sources. I will conclude the explanation of the ibus Hangul input source and proceed directly to work in the terminal. The hanja conversion shortcut is configured with the hanja key in F9. Since F9 is a shortcut frequently used in various applications, I will remove it. While you can manually add the right control key to the hanja conversion shortcut, it is better to configure the right control key to be recognized as a hanja key to match the Korean keyboard layout. As mentioned earlier, for environments without Hangul key and hanja key, it is recommended to configure the keys to match the Korean layout rather than setting them via the shortcuts in the Hangul input source. In the terminal window, you can configure the keys for the Korean layout by setting xkb-options in input sources. I will change the right Alt key to the Hangul key and the right Control key to the hanja key. You can also configure the Hangul toggle shortcut for ibus Hangul input source using G settings. You can also configure the hanja conversion shortcut for ibus Hangul input source using G settings. In applications developed with Qt, if the mode of ibus Hangul input source is set to Korean, an issue may occur where characters are printed after a space input. This can be resolved by changing the use event forwarding setting to true. Nowadays, since Qt is being developed with ibus Hangul input source in mind, the use event forwarding setting may not be necessary. In fact, you might experience issues where keys like enter, space, backspace, delete, and arrow do not work. In this case, you can disable it by changing the use event forwarding setting to false. Let's check the overall settings for the ibus input source. The next input method is set to super space. Since the ibus Hangul input source supports both Korean and English modes through mode switching, the English input source has been removed, so switching the input method is not required. Emojis are provided with shortcuts that allow for easy input via annotation typing. Unicode is also provided with shortcuts that allow input via code point typing. There is one more convenient input method unique to Linux for special characters: input via compose key. Older Unix keyboards had a separate compose key, but since modern keyboards do not, it is recommended to use rarely used keys such as scroll lock or insert as compose key. Compose key settings are configured in xkb-options. Since the previously configured Hangul key and hanja key are also set in xkb-options, care must be taken to ensure that no values are omitted when configuring using the gsettings command. The Hangul key, hanja key, and compose key settings configured in xkb-options will take effect after a reboot. Since not many people are familiar with the compose key, I will show a simple example of its usage. Let's try typing the number 15 enclosed in a circle. Press the key set as the compose key. In my case, I set it to the insert key. When you press the compose key, it waits for character combination. If you type the opening parenthesis, the number 15, and the closing parenthesis, they will be combined to input the number 15 enclosed in a circle. Let's also try typing a right arrow. Simply press the compose key and then type the dash in the closing arrow bracket in sequence. Lines containing a mix of Korean and Japanese characters have wider line spacing compared to English, which can cause the height of the characters to vary from line to line. You can make the line height consistent by setting the font to Korean. Since the default font for text editors is set to monospace, the same issue occurs even when Ubuntu is installed in Korean. Personally, I prefer fixed-width fonts for text editors for readability, so I will set it to the Nodo Sans Mono CJKKR font. If you have installed the Korean language pack from the region and language menu in system, Korean fonts are installed along with it. The Nodo Sans Mono CJKKR font is one of those installed at that time. Now, the line spacing will be consistent. Thank you for watching.